Jonathan Miller adjusted his tie as he stepped through the glass doors of Lancaster Bistro, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. The warm lighting reflected off the elegant chandeliers, casting a soft glow over the neatly dressed patrons. The hum of quiet conversation mixed with the gentle notes of a jazz piano playing in the background, creating a refined yet inviting atmosphere. Jonathan, the director of internal affairs, had spent his morning buried in reports and meetings, dealing with disputes between city departments and overseeing law enforcement accountability. His job required constant vigilance, ensuring the system operated fairly and without corruption. But today, for just 1 hour, he hoped to escape all of that. He wanted nothing more than to enjoy a peaceful lunch before returning to the chaos of his office. A young hostess greeted him with a professional smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Table for one?" "Yes, please," Jonathan replied with a nod. "Right this way." She led him to a quiet table by the window. From here, he could enjoy a view of the bustling city streets outside while still maintaining some privacy. He set his briefcase beside his chair, exhaled slowly, and allowed himself to relax for the first time that day. After handing him the menu, the waitress gave a friendly recommendation. "Our special today is Wagyu Ribeye steak with truffle mashed potatoes. Would you like to try it?" "That sounds perfect," Jonathan said. "And a glass of red wine, please." The waitress smiled and disappeared toward the kitchen. Jonathan leaned back, momentarily enjoying the tranquility. But the moment of peace didn't last long. The restaurant door swung open forcefully, causing the bell above it to jingle loudly. The sudden noise made a few patrons glance toward the entrance. A man in a police uniform walked in, his posture stiff and assertive, his boots clicking heavily against the polished floor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded an air of arrogance that immediately disrupted the restaurant's refined atmosphere. Officer Ryan Blake scanned the room, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Jonathan's table. His expression twisted into a scowl as he marched across the room with determined strides. Several diners quickly averted their eyes, not wanting to attract his attention. Stopping directly in front of Jonathan, Ryan crossed his arms. "You're sitting at my table." Jonathan looked up, meeting Ryan's gaze with a calm but firm expression. "Excuse me?" Ryan sighed impatiently. "This table. I always sit here. Move." Jonathan remained composed, carefully setting down his glass of water. "I was seated here by the staff. If there's a mistake, perhaps you should speak with them." Ryan's jaw tightened. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Jonathan. "I don't need to talk to anyone. I reserved this table." Jonathan glanced around. No sign indicated the table was reserved, and the restaurant was still half empty. He could already tell this wasn't about a simple seating issue. "I'm afraid that's not my concern," Jonathan replied. "I've already ordered my meal, and I see no reason to move." Ryan's nostrils flared. He hated being told no. He had spent years using his badge to intimidate people into getting his way, and he wasn't about to let some bureaucrat defy him. "Listen," Ryan said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening tone. "I don't care what the staff told you. I sit here every week. You're in my spot, so unless you want trouble, I suggest you pick up your things and move. Now." The nearby diners had begun to take notice. The quiet murmur of conversation had died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. Jonathan could feel the weight of their gazes, waiting to see how he would respond. He took a slow, measured breath. This was a test. If he backed down now, he wouldn't just be giving up a table. He'd be allowing this officer to abuse his authority unchecked. With steady confidence, Jonathan met Ryan's glare. "I appreciate your request," he said, his voice level, "but I will not be moving." Ryan's fist clenched. A muscle twitched in his jaw. The tension in the air was thick, and for a brief moment, neither man moved. Then Ryan leaned down slightly, his voice now a whisper only Jonathan could hear. "You think you can talk back to me?" His lips curled into a sneer. "I don't care who you are. You're just another nobody who doesn't know his place." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. He had encountered men like Ryan before, officers who believed the badge gave them unchecked power, and he knew that this confrontation was far from over. Jonathan held Ryan's glare, his expression calm but firm. He could feel the weight of the moment, the way the entire restaurant had fallen silent, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. He had dealt with intimidation tactics before, but rarely so blatantly, and certainly not in such a public place. Ryan scoffed, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you?" His voice was low and threatening, just enough for Jonathan to hear. "I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing. You don't want to piss off the wrong people." Jonathan slowly picked up his glass of water and took a sip, his every movement controlled and deliberate. He wouldn't let this man rattle him. "And what exactly is the right thing?" he asked. "Giving in to a power-hungry cop who thinks he owns a table in a public restaurant?" Ryan's eyes darkened. "You've got a smart mouth," he muttered. Jonathan set his glass down. "And you have an abuse of power problem." The words landed like a slap. Ryan's posture stiffened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. For a split second, Jonathan saw something flicker in the officer's expression. Rage, frustration, maybe even a hint of doubt. But then Ryan smirked. "You really think you can sit there and talk to me like that?" He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Do you know who I am?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "Yes," he said simply. "You're Officer Ryan Blake." He paused for a second before adding, "And that badge on your chest? It doesn't make you untouchable." Ryan let out a cold laugh, shaking his head. "Untouchable," he repeated. "No, see, that's where you're wrong." His expression turned smug. "I am the law around here. And guys like you don't get to question that." Jonathan exhaled slowly. He could feel the restaurant staff watching from the corners of the room, unsure whether to step in. A few customers had discreetly pulled out their phones, pretending to check messages but clearly recording the scene. Ryan hadn't noticed. Or maybe he just didn't care. "You don't belong here," Ryan said, his voice now loud enough for the nearby diners to hear. "And I don't just mean at this table." His tone was laced with something ugly, something that made Jonathan's stomach tighten. Jonathan had heard it before, the veiled implications, the unspoken rules that men like Ryan thought they could enforce. Jonathan sighed. "You should be careful what you say, Officer Blake," he said, his voice even. "People are listening." Ryan's smirk faltered. He glanced around and finally seemed to realize the number of eyes on him. His nostrils flared, his face reddening slightly. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You think these people care?" Ryan sneered. "You think anyone's gonna stop me if I decide you need to be taught a lesson?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. His instincts told him the situation was getting dangerous. He had seen officers like Ryan push boundaries before, testing how far they could go before someone stopped them, and Ryan was teetering on the edge. Jonathan had to make a choice. He could stand his ground and risk escalating this further, or he could try to defuse the situation before it spiraled out of control. He chose the third option. Very slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket, not for a weapon, but for his phone. He kept his movements deliberate, ensuring there was no sudden motion that Ryan could use as an excuse to act. Ryan's eyes flickered to the phone, and his expression twisted into something halfway between suspicion and irritation. "What, you gonna call someone?" Ryan mocked. "Go ahead, call your lawyer, call your boss. Hell, call your mommy, see if I care." Jonathan didn't react. He tapped his screen once, sending a pre-written emergency message to someone who would care. Ryan noticed the movement and let out a sharp breath of laughter. "Oh, you're scared now?" Jonathan met his eyes. "No," he said simply. Ryan frowned. Something about Jonathan's tone unsettled him. Before he could respond, the restaurant door opened again. A patrol officer stepped inside, scanning the room. He locked eyes with Jonathan, then looked at Ryan, his brows furrowing. Ryan's shoulders tensed. Jonathan knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. Officer Ryan Blake's posture stiffened as he spotted the patrol officer stepping into the restaurant. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. For the first time since this confrontation began, he looked uncertain. Jonathan Miller sat calmly, watching everything unfold. He wasn't afraid, not of Ryan, not of his threats, but he knew a cornered man could be dangerous. The patrol officer, a young cop named Ethan Cole, walked toward them cautiously. His eyes flicked between the two men, taking in the tense standoff and the uneasy silence of the restaurant. He had clearly received Jonathan's emergency alert. "Everything okay here, Officer Blake?" Ethan asked carefully. Ryan's face hardened. He forced a smirk. Just handling a situation? Ethan hesitated, glancing at Jonathan, then at the surrounding diners, many of whom had their phones out recording. He wasn't stupid. Something was very wrong here. Jonathan didn't say a word. He let the moment hang, watching as Ryan tried to figure out his next move. Ryan exhaled sharply and turned back to Jonathan. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "You think calling in backup is going to change anything?" He leaned in, his expression dark. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Jonathan met his gaze unflinchingly. "Neither do you." That was it. Ryan snapped. Without warning, his hand shot to his holster, and in one swift motion, he pulled out his gun and pointed it directly at Jonathan. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. A woman let out a sharp scream. Chairs scraped against the floor as diners scrambled backward, some ducking under tables, others rushing toward the exit. Ethan took an instinctive step back, his hand immediately going to his own weapon. But he didn't draw. Not yet. Jonathan, however, did not move. He had faced threats before, intimidation tactics, political pressure, even attempted blackmail. But this was different. Ryan's face was flushed, his grip on the gun too tight, his chest rising and falling rapidly. This wasn't a calculated move anymore. This was desperation. "Get up!" Ryan's voice shook with rage. Jonathan stayed perfectly still. "Put the gun down, officer." "I said, get up!" Ryan's voice was almost a roar now. The gun trembled slightly in his hand. Jonathan spoke carefully, evenly. "Think, Ryan. You pull that trigger, and your career, your life is over." Ryan's breathing quickened. The weight of his own actions was creeping in, but his pride, his anger, his arrogance wouldn't let him back down. "You don't tell me what to do," he spat. His finger hovered over the trigger. Jonathan exhaled slowly, keeping his hands visible on the table. He didn't dare make any sudden movements. Behind Ryan, Ethan lifted his radio, speaking in a hushed but urgent voice. 1033. Officer needs assistance. Armed suspect. Lancaster Bistro. Jonathan caught the words. Backup was coming. But would it get here in time? Ryan's eyes flickered to Ethan for a split second, just long enough for Jonathan to act. With deliberate calm, Jonathan lifted his phone, pressing one button. The restaurant's overhead speakers crackled to life. And then, a voice. A deep, commanding voice that immediately silenced the entire room. "Ryan Blake, stand down. This is Chief Harper." Ryan froze. His eyes widened, his gun hand trembling. Jonathan had done exactly what Ryan never expected. He had called the chief of police directly. Through the speakers, Chief Samuel Harper's voice was cold, unyielding. "I have officers en route to your location," he continued. "Drop your weapon. Now." Ryan's face drained of color. He turned slowly toward the speakers, as if unable to believe what he was hearing. "Ryan," Harper's voice was sharper now. "If you don't put that gun down immediately, you will not leave that building as a police officer." Ryan's chest rose and fell erratically. He was trapped. He knew it. Jonathan watched him closely. This was the moment, the last chance for Ryan to make the right choice. The gun shook in Ryan's grip. His jaw clenched. And then, he lowered it. The entire restaurant let out a collective exhale. Ryan placed the gun on the table, his hand still hovering over it, his face ashen. Ethan rushed forward, grabbing the firearm and stepping back, his own weapon still holstered. "Smart choice," he muttered. Jonathan finally let himself relax, just slightly. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The restaurant was silent, except for the distant wail of approaching sirens. Ryan Blake stood motionless, his face pale, his breathing uneven. The gun was now out of his hands, confiscated by Officer Ethan Cole. But the damage was done. He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Jonathan Miller remained seated, his expression unreadable. He could feel every eye in the room on them, could hear the barely contained whispers of stunned diners. Some were still recording, their phones capturing what would soon become headline news. The front doors burst open. 2 uniformed officers stormed in, their hands near their holsters, scanning the scene. But they weren't the only ones. Behind them, moving with calm authority, was Chief Samuel Harper himself. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Chief Harper was an imposing figure. Late 50s, tall, with graying hair and sharp eyes that had seen more than their fair share of trouble. He was not a man to be tested. Ryan swallowed hard, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He didn't dare speak. Harper's gaze swept over the room before settling on Jonathan. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice measured but firm. "Are you all right?" Jonathan gave a slight nod. "I'm fine." Harper's eyes flicked to Ryan, who still hadn't moved. His face hardened. "Officer Blake," Harper said, his voice colder now. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ryan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked like a man grasping for an excuse, but there was none. Not this time. Ryan finally managed. "I was just..." Harper held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "Don't," he warned. A tense beat of silence passed. Harper turned back to Jonathan. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Jonathan's voice was calm but firm. "I was seated here by the staff. Officer Blake came in and demanded I move. When I refused, he escalated, first with verbal threats, then by drawing his weapon." Harper's jaw tightened. He turned toward Ethan. "Cole?" Ethan nodded. "I arrived in the middle of it. When I saw the situation, I called for backup. He had his gun pointed at Mr. Miller when I got here." Harper exhaled sharply. He didn't look surprised, just disappointed. Ryan took a small step forward, his voice strained. "Sir, Harper turned on him with fire in his eyes. "Shut your mouth." Ryan froze. Harper took another step toward him. His voice dropped to a deadly quiet tone. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Ryan's lips pressed into a tight line. He still hadn't grasped the full weight of his mistake. Harper shook his head, then turned to the officers behind him. "Officer Blake is officially relieved of duty, effective immediately. Take his badge and escort him outside." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Even Ryan stiffened, his breath hitching. "Sir, don't," Harper snapped. "You don't get to speak, not after pulling a weapon on a civilian." One of the officers stepped forward. "Your badge, Officer Blake." Ryan hesitated, his fingers twitching. He looked as though he might resist, might try to fight this. But then his gaze flicked to the phones still recording him, to the uniformed officers surrounding him, to Harper's unrelenting stare. And he knew it was over. Slowly, with shaking hands, Ryan unclipped his badge from his uniform and placed it on the table. The moment it left his fingers, it was as if the power drained from his body. His shoulders slumped. His breathing became ragged. One of the officers stepped beside him. "Let's go." Ryan swallowed hard, then turned to Jonathan. His expression was a mixture of anger and something almost like regret. But Jonathan didn't flinch. He held Ryan's gaze, unwavering. Ryan opened his mouth, as if to say something, but then thought better of it. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, the officers escorting him out. The moment the door swung shut behind them, the tension in the restaurant finally broke. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. People exhaled, some still staring at Jonathan in disbelief. Harper sighed, rubbing his temple. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath. Then he looked at Jonathan again. "I'm sorry this happened," he said, his voice sincere. "You deserve better than that." Jonathan nodded. "I appreciate that, Chief." Harper exhaled. "This isn't over," he warned. "There'll be an official investigation. And I can tell you right now, Ryan Blake won't be walking away from this." Jonathan nodded once. "Good." Harper gave him a long, assessing look, then turned to the remaining officers. "Get statements from the witnesses. I want everything documented." Then before walking away, he glanced at Jonathan one last time. "You handled yourself well today." Jonathan simply gave a small nod. But as Harper left the restaurant, Jonathan sat back in his chair, his mind still racing. Because he knew this wasn't just about one corrupt cop. This was about something much bigger. And the fight? It was just beginning. The incident at Lancaster Bistro spread fast. By morning, news outlets were running the story nonstop. Headlines flooded social media. Police officer pulls gun on city official in restaurant standoff. Video footage captured by diners went viral. Within hours, there were protests outside the police department. People weren't just outraged at Ryan Blake. They were angry at the system that allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. Jonathan Miller watched it all unfold from his office. He wasn't surprised. This was bigger than just one bad cop. It always had been. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." Chief Samuel Harper stepped inside looking exhausted. He dropped a folder onto Jonathan's desk. "Blake's been fired. The DA is filing criminal charges." Jonathan nodded. "Good." Harper studied him for a moment. "You don't look satisfied." Jonathan exhaled. "Because this isn't just about one officer. You know that." Harper sighed, rubbing his temple. "Yeah, I do." He gestured toward the folder. "That's every complaint ever filed against Blake. Excessive force, abuse of power, racial discrimination. Half of them were buried before they even made it to an investigator." Jonathan flipped through the pages. It was worse than he expected. Harper shook his head. "This should have never happened." Jonathan met his gaze. "Then let's make sure it doesn't happen again." Harper let out a bitter chuckle. "You're asking me to fix an entire system?" "No," Jonathan said firmly. "I'm asking you to start." A long silence passed. Then Harper nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." They shook hands. And just like that, the real fight began. Months later, Ryan Blake stood in a packed courtroom, hands clasped in front of him. The charges were read aloud. Misuse of authority, reckless endangerment, unlawful brandishing of a firearm. Jonathan sat near the front. He watched as Ryan kept his eyes down, the arrogance from that day in the restaurant completely gone. His defense tried to argue stress, lack of judgment, a lapse in control. But the evidence was undeniable. The video, the witnesses, the truth, the verdict, guilty. The sentence, 5 years in prison, permanently barred from law enforcement. As Ryan was led away in cuffs, he looked up, just once. His eyes met Jonathan's. For the first time, there was no defiance, only regret. Jonathan held his gaze for a moment, then he turned away. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. 1 year later, the city was changing. New policies were in place. Mandatory body cameras, independent civilian review boards, stricter oversight of misconduct cases. It wasn't a perfect system. There was still work to do. But it was a start. And Jonathan, he kept fighting, because some battles were worth it.